It's time for another episode of the History Behind the Headline.
So in my last video, I mentioned that King George never directly responded to the colonists after the Declaration of Independence. Now, the series that I'm doing on the Declaration of Independence are short videos, but they're not standalone videos. So you're really better served by watching them in order. And this is part 2. Now, even though King George didn't respond directly to the colonists, sometimes you get the impression that he may have, especially if you watch this popular video with how many multiple million views. But really, it's true that by the time the Declaration of Independence was written, it was too late for the king to apologize. But it didn't matter because the king had no interest ever to apologize. But I still like that video. Also, no, he didn't sing that song either. So, moving on. Even though the king didn't respond, the British government did select John Lind to give the official response to the Declaration of Independence. And his response came from across the pond, or as they used to say in the past, the Great Pond, which is, as you can see, the Atlantic Ocean. And across the pond in merry old England is where some of the biggest haters of the Declaration live. But so what, you say? So what? Who cares what the haters think, right? Didn't those Yankee Doodle dandies send those redcoats back home with their tail between their legs? Well, we study history to get a more complete view of the past. When we study history, we want to study it from as many perspectives as possible to get as much of a complete view of the past as possible. So back to our story. So John Lind immediately comes out swinging. First, he wants to explain why the king is not responding, but he is responding to the colonists. So sometime after July 4th, 1776, John Lind writes, "It would be unwise for a king to get into public argument with his subjects who are in open rebellion against him." He also says that it would be wrong for the king's ministers to respond to the bold and disrespectful declaration. After all, he says, consider who wrote it. He asks, who are the members of this mighty Congress? Sarcastically. What's their authority? Now, here's a little background. Remember, the colonists didn't want to replace a British king with an American king. So they did debate for a while what was the leader going to be called for this new nation. And as we know, they came up with the title president. And of course, you had the delegates. John Lind, he's not impressed. So at the time, John Lind writes, with whatever titles they may dignify themselves, in respect to us at least, they are but simple individuals. The founders of America, simple individuals. In fact, they were actually some of the most well-read individuals at the time. But be that as it may, to John Lind, they were but simple individuals. And what Lind doesn't know at this time, and couldn't possibly know, of course, was the worldwide influence that was to come with the Declaration of Independence. And I'll get to that later. But at this time in 1776, across the pond, it was just absurd and false. Many in London found it offensive. And yet, as historian Howard Peckman noted, no official in London stood up immediately and denounced or refuted one by one these charges in the Declaration. Of course, the king himself was not going to dignify them by replying, as I indicated. Apparently, his ministers felt also that to answer and deny the accusations would give official recognition to a document they wished to classify as propaganda. And yet, you couldn't just ignore it. Why? The uneasy feeling persisted that unless some notice was taken, certain Englishmen and several foreign governments might believe the charges or chalk them up to exaggerations of oppressive actions the king had taken, that people would conclude there must be some fire to have produced so much smoke. And that's where John Lind comes in. He puts together this 110-page response to a one-page declaration. And I've read those 110 pages, so you don't have to. Now, Lynn begins by saying, because these colonists because of their lower social standing, a private citizen could respond to them. And after all, the Declaration is offensive to the entire British Empire, and therefore, an insult offered to every man may be repelled by any man. But he also goes further. He says the Americans insult the king by groundless complaints. And Lynn, they can't even agree on words and terminology. How the colonists identify themselves and how they're viewed in Britain, there's a wide gulf. Specifically, you recall this quote from the Declaration: "The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries, with the goal of creating an absolute tyranny over these states." And then they say, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So the letter was an open letter for the world to see. There are reasons on why they were breaking away. But the key phrase that Lynn focuses on is these states. This is what he says in response. What they call these states, as in these United States, we call His Majesty's subjects in America. But there's other words in this paragraph that were really, truly offensive to Lynn. History of repeated injuries, absolute tyranny over these states. Lynn's response is, this is an atrocious charge. Think of it as horrifyingly wicked. The Declaration, he says, is not supported by proofs, and Americans are just being deluded. They're deluded people believing something that's false. In fact, he says that the colonists are being used as stilts for a handful of men who are manipulating them, using them for their own selfish ends. He makes a big case that the American Congress is deceptive. What does he mean by that? He says, first of all, they first initially began attacking ministers, and then they attacked the parliament, but then they threw everybody in, including the king, and now the entire British system is responsible for their suffering. Lynn derives from that really these revolutionaries always had independence in their mind, and that was always the goal. But they were misleading people in England, including the king, who thought that they were complaining in good faith all the time, wanting to remain a part of the empire, but truly their intentions are now fully known, that they were just being deceptive, because independence had always been the motive for their reaction to the actions that Britain took, which led to independence. So let's quickly review Lynn's arguments so far. Number one, His Majesty's subjects are pretending to be more than who they are. They're trying to deny the reality that they're mere subjects, talking about these states. In other words, this is the stay in your lane argument. Number two, Lynn claims there's no evidence in the Declaration. There's no proof. And that's another reason it can be discounted or discarded. Number three, the accusations are wildly absurd. They're false. And number four, that the local leadership among the 13 colonies are really deceiving the colonists. He says that the Americans are deluded. And part of the reason why he says that the colonies are deceptive is because, again, all along, they are wanting independence, but they're not clear about their true intentions, not fully clear until they produced the Declaration of Independence. Now, when you read Lynn, you come away with the impression that here's a guy who probably thinks that that document is probably only good to line his birdcage. I mean, that's probably what he would have done with it, if that. But I want you to contrast the way he would deal with it with the way we treat that document. Here is the Declaration of Independence, as you can see. It's so old you can barely read it, but it's actually housed in the rotunda of the National Archives building in Washington, where the Declaration of Independence is housed in a state-of-the-art encasement. John Lind never lived to see this. He's probably rolling in his grave because of the outcome. And before this series is done, we're going to cover a couple of more of his major arguments and put them in perspective with what the colonists were saying. To, again, let you decide whether you think the colonists were justified or unjustified in breaking away from mother country. That's all I have for now. So thank you for watching. And if you'd like to know more, be sure to read the notes that I left in the description with some links for additional information. And remember, the past is never dead. It isn't even past.